It is the Sengoku Jidai. Besieged and surrounded by his enemies, a lord pays a group of men to see his only child to safety. But do they have the skill to ensure her safety? And can they even be trusted? For this is an age of honor and treachery, of blood and valor, of gold and steel. Now available at Amazon, Smashwords, and at StudioBrainstorm.net. Links in the description. So, let's not beat around the bush here. We've got a brand new overarching story arc this time, the first since the end of the Covenant arc. And Miller has only 9 issues left to pull this off. 12 if you count Dueling Ambitions. Even so, that is nil compared to the 35 issues dedicated to the Covenant. Like with Faithful Execution, we have a one-time guest artist brought on board, named Ron Chan this time. And apparently this is the only comic he's done for Star Wars and possibly the only comic ever, as I couldn't find anything else he'd done. The covers, meanwhile, were done by Benjamin Carré. I hope I got that right. This cover, in my opinion, is possibly the best in the entire series, which is hardly surprising given that Carré is a French comic artist. Now, as an American, I enjoy the same cracks about the French as anyone else, but trust me when I say that the French-speaking world has forgotten more about writing and drawing comic books than America, Japan, and South Korea have learned combined. Granted, this still remains something of an open secret, and very few people are aware of it. Hell, I only became aware of it last year. But let's try and avoid going off on a tangent this time. Masks takes place on a relatively lush and peaceful world called War Tandil, where our heroes are trying to come to grips with the events of the previous story arc. Actually, that's kind of untrue. Jerael seems to be doing her best to avoid dealing with the consequences of the last arc. In fact, she doesn't even want to talk about it. Which is understandable. I mean, 1, Jedi being the guardians of peace and justice for 1,000 generations are kind of the natural enemies of slavers, even former ones, technically. And 2, being part of the Crucible is an aspect of her past that Jerael is understandably not very proud of. But among the many skills that Zane never acquired as a Padawan was knowing when to leave well enough alone. And apparently after him constantly asking her for a while, Jerael finally caves and talks about it, maybe in the hopes that he'll stop. Jerael was taken by the Crucible when she was a child, and like all the slaves, she was forced to fight continuously. Being a child, that usually meant fighting other children or really small aliens. The transition from slave to slaver came when Jerael realized that the woman overseeing her and her little group of slaves was just another slave that had been promoted to the role. And so Jerael had challenged the other woman for the job of overseer and won. The Crucible is an institution that only respects strength, and so now that Jerael was in charge of her fellow slaves, she tried her best to make things easier for them, to give them the best chance of succeeding. Of course, this usually meant the successful ones being sold off to dueling leagues like the franchise, but given that the alternatives included remaining as a sparring partner for the Crucible, which meant a life of perpetual violence, or being sold off to sleazy mining and/or medical corporations that could use some extra warm bodies for God alone knows what, ending up like Gothar Kleege was something to aspire to. Jerael did the best she could, but she was only a single overseer, and a teenager at that, in an institution where there were hundreds like her, not to mention the even more sadistic higher-ups of the Crucible. The constant cruelty and brutality, as well as her own helplessness, nearly drove her to the brink, and that was when she crossed paths with Camper, who helped her escape and go into hiding. Since Camper was himself trying to hide from a Dascorp, the two of them living in a small junkyard on Terrace seemed like a smart move, and it actually worked for a while. But then Zane and Griff came along that fateful day, and the rest is history. Being the idealistic sort, Zane suggests that maybe now they can do something. Together. Jerael's not alone after all. but Jor-El can only scoff at the idea. The crew of the Hot Prospect, a little circus of misfits aboard a derelict ship, take on the Crucible? Utterly ridiculous. No, the way that she sees it, all they can do is keep moving. The two friends part company. Jor-El goes back to the ship and is surprised to see that Malik is here, while Zane goes into town and finds that the Republic is here. Or rather, the Revankists are, although their eponymous leader is not. Big things have happened since Zane was last in touch with the Jedi Order, because apparently they've now consented to helping the Republic fight the Mandalorians. What caused this change in attitude? Let's talk about the Battle of Cathar. Remember how I said way back in the primer video that the Mandalorian Wars were not officially begun by the Republic's reckoning until the Battle of Vanquo, but that the Mandalorians had been carrying out small battles and raids leading up to that point? The Battle of Cathar was one of them, and by far the worst. Back during the Sith War, when Mandalore the Indomitable sided with Ulic Qel-Droma and Exar Kun, Cathar was one of the many worlds upon which the Mandalorians had fought in the cause of the Sith. The Cathars, however, fought back so effectively that they beat the Mandalorians, and apparently this became a sore point with them. So sore, in fact, that it became a grudge. When Mandalore the Ultimate became leader, and decided that the time had come to take the fight back to the Republic, he decided to give the task of punishing the Cathars to Cassus Fett. At first, no one knew what really happened. When a few Cathar that had been made Jedi Knights returned to their world, they found it almost completely deserted. The buildings were left intact, but there was no sign of the people. It was as if the Cathar race had just packed up and left. However, Cathar refugee communities began popping up on other worlds, all telling garbled tales of Mandalorian harassment and attack. A few years down the line, the Revankists came to Cathar. They were convinced that the Mandalorians had to be responsible, and that if they could just find proof, they could finally persuade the Council to back the war. Of course, this was in the aftermath of Vindication, and so the Council, having already dealt with the Covenant, had very little patience for another schismatic faction within their ranks. A Council delegation was sent to Cathar to essentially demand that the Revankists stop trying to drag the Order into a war they felt didn't concern the Jedi, when the Revankist leader discovered a Mandalorian mask. And suddenly every Jedi present beheld a Force vision of what had really happened that terrible day. Cassus Fett had struck with ruthless efficiency. In every single community, the Cathar were taken by surprise, driven into the sea, and then gunned down, regardless of age or sex. An estimated 90% of the entire Cathar race was killed that day, and thus the indignity to Mandalorian honor was washed away in blood. Cassus Fett had deliberately left the buildings of Cathar intact to serve as a testament to what happened to those who dared cross the Mandalorians. There had only been one who had protested, the one who had owned the mask that the Revankist leader had found. She had protested that there was no need to kill them all, that killing defenseless prisoners was not honorable. Cassus Fett simply responded that if she felt the Cathars needed a defender, she was more than welcome to die with them. And so she had. Then the vision ended, and Revan, leader of the Revankists, claimed the nameless Mandalorian's mask and swore an oath to never stop fighting until the Mandalorians were defeated once and for all. While Zane is learning this story from the other Revankists at the city, Malik is evidently relating a similar story to Jor-El and the others at the Hot Prospect. And yet again, I have to stop and point out a pretty great line of dialogue courtesy of John Jackson Miller. Malik is more than a name. It's who I was born to be. The Mandalorians destroyed my first life on Quelii. Since then, I've answered to names others gave me, names that weren't mine, because I didn't care. My home was gone. What did it matter who I was? But it does matter. There's nobody left who remembers who I was before, but they'll remember Malik. I'll make sure of that. If you went into this comic series with absolutely no knowledge of the games, then this would sound like a pretty determined and even inspiring speech. But with the context knowledge of the KOTOR games and of Malik's eventual fate, it takes on this ominous overtone, and that's what makes this so brilliant. It really is amazing what a little change in context can do. Anyway, the main reason that Malik is here is that he's still kinda sweet on Jerael and wants to recruit her to work with the Revankists. Just Jerael, mind you. He'd like to bring Zane and Griff along, but the Covenant and Zane's false allegations of murder are still a sore point in the Jedi Order, and the Revankists' legitimacy with the Council is still razor thin. Of course, the idea of taking Jerael away is Roland's new berserk button, and the Mandalorian immediately punches Malik in the face for that suggestion. Of course, violent Mandalorians are Malik's berserk button, and he damn near comes close to killing Roland before Zane and the other Revankists arrive at the camp and manage to pull the two apart. Anyway, Malik is still dead set on recruiting Jerael, and when she doesn't immediately say yes to the idea, Zane realizes that his friend needs more time to decide what she wants to do with, frankly, her life in general. She really hasn't had much direction since Camper left. And so he decides to buy time by pretending that he and Jerael are in a relationship and that she won't go anywhere without him. Thus, Malik backs down. Of course, Zane knows it's all just a delaying tactic. Malik will be back at some point, but at least Jerael will have the freedom to choose for herself. And I really do like how after this, Jerael asks if there really is a chance to beat the Crucible, for the first time allowing herself to hope that maybe things can change for the better this time. Alone as an overseer within the Crucible, she had been effectively powerless, but now she's not alone anymore. Even if Camper's gone, she still has friends who have her back. And again, I have to give full props to Miller for the dialogue that he gives Zane here. You told me something you were hiding. Well, I haven't told you what I did on my weeks away. I didn't want to. Griff wouldn't understand. But the truth is, I do have resources to call upon, more than you can imagine. I'm not a Jedi Knight, but I'm not alone. This is not a circus act, and I'm not a clown. And so, our leading man and leading lady now have a new mission. Break a galaxy-spanning clandestine slaving organization. A for ambition, if nothing else. Which of course brings us to the 2-issue arc, The Reaping. Benjamin Carré remains the cover artist, but we have Bongdazo coming in to do the interiors. At any rate, picking up from where we left off, Zane and Jerael may be resolved to take down the Crucible, but there's still only 6 aboard the Hot Prospect if you count Slisk and LB. And even Zane's nebulous other resources might not be enough to take down an organization that's lasted as long as the Crucible has. And so they have to start small. And that generally means sabotage. And so our story begins in the Deep Core, specifically the Kurnocht cluster, which is interesting because that's also the setting of the Black Fleet Crisis trilogy, a book series I haven't yet gotten to but would very much like to someday. Minor details aside, the Hot Prospect arrives out of hyperspace with the plan to scam the Sungrazer Cooperative, a particularly unsavory interstellar mining operation. It is to organizations like this that the Crucible sends the slaves they deem to be failures, useless for either fighting in the pits or in the sports arenas. The Sungrazer Cooperative uses slaves to mine valuable substances from comets and asteroids. This is what is known as dust diving. Cometary bodies, you see, contain ice as well as rock and minerals. The only way to get at the valuable substances locked within them is when they are close enough to a sun that the heat starts to melt the ice. What makes dust diving dangerous is that as the ice melts and the temperature increases, the comet becomes increasingly unstable and begins to break apart, sometimes explosively so. As a result, such men and women rarely last long. But that's alright as far as the Sungrazer Cooperative is concerned, because they have access to the Crucible and its near bottomless supply of expendable organic life. So what exactly is the plan here? Well, in a nutshell, to try and sabotage the Crucible's relationship with its many customers. After the Hot Prospect arrives in system, Zane and Jerael board the Sungrazer ship disguised as Crucible operatives, claiming that because business conditions have changed, they are here to renegotiate the terms of their agreement with the cooperative by demanding a larger share of their profits. Of course, this is all a cover giving them the opportunity to free the Sungrazer Cooperative's slaves, but they don't know that. For that matter, neither does Griff. He really thinks they're just here to try and scam the cooperative out of some of those valuable minerals. Zane and Jarael are decent actors, but unfortunately, Zane's relationship with the Force being what it is, things immediately start going downhill. First, it turns out they've completely underestimated the number of slaves that the cooperative employs, and there are 80 slaves to be freed instead of 8. Second, after the initial intimidation, the leaders of the Sungrazer Cooperative begin getting suspicious, and very soon, our heroes' covers are blown. Luckily, Zane and Jarael are also good at thinking up new plans on the fly. Since the slaves are already being sent out in force to mine another comet, Zane and Jarael opt to go outside with them. Zane then uses his lightsaber to disable the countermeasures used by the cooperative to keep the slaves in line, and then contacts the Hot Prospect. Once it's close enough, he uses the Force to push the hapless slaves toward the ship's hangar, much to Griff's annoyance once he realizes that he's been conned into a humanitarian mission instead of one for profit. But the bad news doesn't end there. As I said earlier, the leaders of the Sungrazer Cooperative figured out very quickly that something fishy was going on, and so they've summoned help from the real Crucible, specifically a nasty piece of work known as the Gladiator. And as if things couldn't get any worse, when the Gladiator contacts the Hot Prospect ordering it to stand down, Jarael immediately recognizes the Gladiator's captain as Dace Galliard, the man who brought her into the Crucible to begin with. In fact, we even get a little flashback showing how they met. Being a slaver ship, of course, the Gladiator begins sending out these things called Sky Reaper drones to recover the escaping slaves. And of course they look like something out of a Hoshino Yukinobu manga because sci-fi tentacles are just inescapable, damn them all. Only the intervention of Roland Dyer and his jetpack enables Zane and Jarael to get the escaping slaves safely inside the Hot Prospect. Although safely is a very, very relative term at this point. At the same time, the Gladiator snares the Hot Prospect and begins to reel it in. The Hot Prospect itself has only one gun, and it can't really rotate all that far, meaning they can't even fire back at the Gladiator with what little weaponry they've got. Luckily, the Hot Prospect is a mining ship with all kinds of equipment needed to extract and/or refine resources. What's more, it's a derelict ship full of all kinds of nasty and corrosive chemicals. And so the Hot Prospect retaliates by attacking with everything it has. First, using mining drills and harpoons to create breaches in the Gladiator's hull, and then throwing canister after canister of xenoboric acid at them. Still, the Gladiator is a much larger ship than the Hot Prospect, and these tactics, though effective, are little more than a delaying action. Galliard, a former Republic Navy officer, has the discipline and foresight to realize this, even as his crew begins to panic. It's then that Zane realizes there may yet be a way to escape completely. Among the refining equipment built into the Hot Prospect is a massive centrifuge. In fact, the entire ship is built around this mechanism. And so, over Griff's impassioned protests, Zane and some of the escaped slaves jam the centrifuge's mechanism. As expected, the centrifuge stops spinning, but since the mechanism is still going, all the force transfers that spin to the entire Hot Prospect itself. Not only does the spinning vessel break free of the Gladiator's clutches, it even gives Jarael an opportunity to get off a few pot shots with the Hot Prospect's gun. With the Gladiator severely damaged and most of its Sky Reaper drones taken out, the Hot Prospect is finally able to make for hyperspace. The slaves go free at the nearest Republic station, while Zane and Jarael inform the rest of the crew of their intention to keep up the fight against the Crucible. Roland, of course, gives his support because he goes wherever Jarael goes, while Griff is naturally opposed, but he is outvoted. Apparently, Slisk and LB don't get votes. What's actually funny here is that Griff literally says, despairingly, democracy is going to ruin capitalism. Apparently, Star Wars has its version of Adam Smith somewhere in its history. Meanwhile, Galliard, having failed, returns to his leaders in disgrace to accept punishment. And Shantique is clearly itching to give him the Darth Vader treatment. Luckily for Galliard, she is restrained by this new character called Barinjar, and here we actually learn a little something about the hierarchy of the Crucible. Barinjar and Shantique are clearly the two highest-ranking members within the organization, and are clearly equal in power. However, the Crucible's hierarchy is such that both are overseers of different aspects of the organization. Shantique is the Magister Impressor, the one in charge of capturing new slaves, training them, and disposing of the failures. Baranjar holds the post of Magister Protector, the one that's in charge of dealing with any kind of threat to the Crucible itself. This leads the two to have a little bit of an argument over the issue of Zane and Jarael's interference with their operation. Since the interference is with the slave raids, Shantique thinks that this is her realm of responsibility, whereas Baranjar sees this as a threat to the Crucible and therefore his purview. Eventually, Baranjar mollifies Shantique by promising her that there's still an opportunity for her to get revenge on Jarael. She may have friends and allies, but while they can be a strength, they can also be a weakness, and weakness is something that the Crucible can exploit. As if that wasn't enough ominous setup, the reaping ends on Coruscant, where Demigal, who has been unconscious ever since Flashpoint, is finally starting to wake up, and the Republic prepares to put him on trial. I really don't know how to explain it, but although the reaping is action-packed and we learn a few extra details about the Crucible, and it does progress the story with our heroes striking their first blow against the enemy, there's just something lacking in the reaping. Honestly, I think I got a lot more out of Masks, particularly with how well it foreshadows Malik's eventual fate, his determination to win the war, and his increasing hostility towards the Mandalorians, clearly painting the way towards the dark path he will one day walk. Still, the reaping is important, it's not filler. In keeping with the theme of slavery, Miller uses the dust divers as an example of a situation where organic labor is preferable to droids, which helps to justify, quote-unquote, the Crucible's continued existence. Even if it does kind of contradict the idea established in Dueling Ambitions that in a world of droids, the only value of organic slaves would be entertainment. It does progress the plot, and it also drops hints at what's to come. Miller reminds us at the last minute that everything revolving around Demigal remains unresolved, and that he's still clearly an important character to the story, while the last conversation between Shantique and Baranjar gives us a hint as to how the Crucible is going to retaliate against the Hot Prospects crew, and specifically against Jarael. So far, our heroes are doing well for themselves, and though things didn't go quite according to plan, they've still managed to strike a blow against the Crucible. But if Empire Strikes Back and Revenge of the Sith have taught Star Wars fans anything, is that while Star Wars may be an optimistic universe, it is always darkest before the dawn. And trust me when I say that KOTOR the comic is about to go into some very dark territory indeed with the penultimate story arc, Destroyer. Until then.